4 poems from my childhood today, written by A. Milne, who is famous beyond these shores for his Winnie the Pooh stories, which Disney bent to its will. I couldn't bring this enterprise to a close without including Milne. His work has a treasured place in my upbringing, yet, as with much of the literature for kids at the time, at this distance it was clearly and extraordinarily irrelevant for most kids. Fixed firmly in the middle of middle-class England, peopled with nannies, a gentry double-barrelled in name and munition, yokels who thrived as well on a kindly smile as an indifferent sixpence, and all deferring to a benign and bumbling monarchy. Milne gave way to William Brown and Billy Bunter. William's life is more widely recognisable, and perhaps can be traced back to the Grossmith brothers' classic accessible comedy, The Diary of a Nobody, set in Victorian aspirational suburbia. Bunter, on the other hand, lived in a boarding school, in which black eyes and assaults on children by furious teachers wildly wielding sticks were presented as comedic. From this Edwardian mischief, we graduated to comics in which the war continued to be fought against stereotypical racial enemies. It's little wonder Milne's irrelevance seems innocuous in this maelstrom. Dr. Seuss is a far healthier way to bring a child to love language. Hardware stores are my favourite shops, and at one time I thought I'd like to open one which I'd called Jonathan Joe. I didn't, but I did name my favourite son Jonathan. In any case, the only folk old enough to know the reference are pensioners, who all order online from Screwfix. I particularly love the 3-year-old James ordering his mother not to go out without him. Though nascent Napoleonism can be hard to live with, it's a delightful phase if you can watch it as a grandfather. Jonathan Joe. Jonathan Joe has a mouth like an O, and a wheelbarrow full of surprises. If you ask for a bat or something like that, he's got it, whatever the size is. If you're wanting a ball, it's no trouble at all. Why, the more that you ask for, the merrier. Like a hoop and a top, and a watch that won't stop, and some sweets, and an Aberdeen terrier. Jonathan Joe has a mouth like an O, but this is what makes him so funny. If you give him a smile only once in a while, then he never expects any money. Buckingham Palace. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. Alice is marrying one of the guard. A soldier's life is terrible hard, says Alice. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. We saw a guard in a sentry box. One of the sergeants looks after their socks, says Alice. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. We looked for the king, but he never came. Well, God take care of him all the same, says Alice. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. They've great big parties inside the grounds. I wouldn't be the king for £100, says Alice. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. Her face looked out, but it wasn't the king's. He's much too busy assigning things, says Alice. They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. Do you think the king knows all about me? Sure to, dear, but it's time for tea, says Alice. Disobedience. James Morrison, Weatherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, "Mother," he said he, "you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me." James, James Morrison's mother put on a golden gown. James, James Morrison's mother drove to the end of the town. James, James Morrison's mother said to herself, said she, I can get right down to the end of the town and be back in time for tea. King John put up a notice, lost or stolen or strayed. James, James Morrison's mother seems to have been mislaid. Last seen wandering vaguely, quite of her own accord. She tried to get down to the end of the town. 40 shillings reward. James, James Morrison, commonly known as Jim, told his other relations not to go blaming him. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town without consulting me. James Morrison's mother hasn't been heard of since. King John said he was sorry. So did the Queen and Prince. King John, somebody told me, said to a man he knew, if people go down to the end of the town, well, what can anyone do? Now then, very softly. James Morrison, Weatherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. The King's Breakfast. The King asked the Queen, and the Queen asked the dairymaid, Could we have some butter for the royal slice of bread? The Queen asked the dairymaid. The dairymaid said, Certainly. I'll go and tell the cow now before she goes to bed. The dairymaid, she curtsied and went and told the Alderney, Don't forget the butter for the royal slice of bread. The Alderney said sleepily, You'd better tell His Majesty that many people nowadays like marmalade instead. The dairymaid said, Fancy, and went to Her Majesty. She curtsied to the Queen, and she turned a little red. Excuse me, Your Majesty, for taking of the liberty, but marmalade is tasty if it's very thickly spread. The Queen said, Oh, and went to His Majesty. Talking of the butter for the royal slice of bread, many people think that marmalade is nicer. Would you like to try a little marmalade instead? The King said, Bother. And then he said, Oh, dearie me. The King sobbed, Oh, dearie me, and went back to bed. Nobody, he whimpered, could call me a fussy man. I only want a little bit of butter for my bread. Queen said, There, and went to the dairymaid. The dairymaid said, There, and went to the shed. The cow said, There, I didn't really mean it. Here's milk for his porringer and butter for his bread. The Queen took the butter and brought it to His Majesty. The King said, Buttery, and bounced out of bed. Nobody, he said, as he kissed her tenderly. Nobody, he said, as he slid down the banisters. Nobody, my darling, could call me a fussy man. But I do like a little bit of butter to my bread.